Nuevamente damos la bienvenida a todos y de inmediato daremos inicio a la sesión plenaria número 1, denominada Promoviendo Confianza para el Desarrollo Económico Regional. Para el efecto, invitamos a los siguientes expositores. Jan Welliser, vicepresidente del Grupo de Prácticas Mundiales de Crecimiento Equitativo, Finanzas e Instituciones del Banco Mundial. A Rachel Grein, presidente de la Federación Internacional de Contadores IFAC. Bill Plack, presidente del Grupo de Trabajo Regulatorio del Comité Global de Políticas Públicas. Alberto Vergara, profesor invitado del Centro de Estudios Latinoamericanos de la Universidad de Georgetown. Y como moderador tendremos a Robbie Senderovich, gerente de aprendizaje e innovación del Banco Mundial. Toda vez que los tenemos a nuestro panel completo en la mesa principal, quiero presentar a quien va a moderar y presidir la mesa. Robbie Senderovich es gerente de innovación y liderazgo del Banco Mundial. Fue representante del Banco Mundial en República Dominicana, gerente de iniciativa global sobre auditoría social. Ha tenido publicaciones sobre confianza a instituciones públicas y presupuesto basado en resultados. Tiene licenciatura de la Universidad de Buenos Aires, máster por la Universidad Johns Hopkins y cursos de posgrado en la Universidad de Stanford y Harvard. Estimado Robbie, tú tienes la conducción de la mesa.
Muchísimas gracias, buenos días a todos y todas las presentes. ¿Cómo están? ¿Hay energía en la sala todavía? Miren que nos queda una semana llena de actividades interesantes y mucha sustancia. El primer panel de apertura fue muy rico, pero les prometo que lo que sigue ahora es mucho mejor. Pero no le digan a los que se fueron recién, porque la gente se ofende. Siempre es bueno estar aquí de regreso en México, un país donde tuve oportunidad de trabajar hace ya algunos años en temas similares a los que estamos trabajando o conversando el día de hoy. Muchas gracias a los organizadores del evento, especialmente a Dan Boyce, Joseph Quisito, Gil Maunda, Dimitri Svetlana, por haberme invitado a moderar esta primer sesión de trabajo más participativa. El tema que tenemos hoy es un tema de gran relevancia para América Latina, para la región de América Latina y el Caribe. Yo diría que es un tema de relevancia estratégica para la región, para el futuro de la región. Lo dijeron los expositores esta mañana, América Latina necesita seguir creciendo, América Latina y el Caribe necesita seguir desarrollándose, y lo que vamos a estar conversando en el panel que sigue es de qué manera la confianza o la falta de confianza muchas veces en instituciones públicas afecta, le pega, como decimos muchas veces, a las posibilidades de crecimiento económico, a las posibilidades de desarrollo para la región. Hay varios motivos, hay varias preguntas, solo por mencionar tres que me parecieron interesantes para estimular el principio de esta conversación. Una tiene que ver con lo que los economistas dicen, los costos de transacción. ¿Hay economistas en la sala? Levanten la mano, ¿quién es un economista aquí en la sala? Who is an economist? Jasmine la tenemos aquí, Jan es un economista. Son pocos los economistas, así que por ahí, si digo algo malo, por favor, no me corrijan, porque si no voy a perder toda credibilidad con el resto de la audiencia. Pero básicamente, ¿quiénes de los aquí presentes manejaron hoy su carro para venir a la conferencia? Levanten la mano, ¿quién manejó? Bueno, ¿el resto manejan sus países, quiero suponer? ¿Sí? Cuando ustedes ven un semáforo rojo, vienen manejando por una avenida y ven un semáforo rojo, ¿qué hacen? ¿Se detienen? Espero que sí. Si ven un semáforo verde, ¿qué hacen? ¿Qué haces? Pasas, avanzas. En amarillo, ¿qué haces con el amarillo? Acá alguien decía en amarillo, ¿qué haces? Acelera. Si hay amarillo, acelera. Y uno puede tomarse la libertad de no reducir la velocidad cuando está verde o acelerar cuando está amarillo, si es que piensa que los que vienen por la calle perpendicular, ¿qué van a hacer? Van a frenar, ¿verdad? Uno tiene confianza en que esa institución que llamamos semáforo funciona y que la gente se acoge a lo que el semáforo dice. Si uno, como en algunos países donde me ha tocado vivir, Cristian, ve que el semáforo está verde, pero uno no está muy seguro que el que viene por la perpendicular, sobre todo a la noche, tarde, no va a frenar, aquí se ríen los compañeros de República Dominicana, ¿qué es lo que hace uno? Aminora, frena un poquitito la marcha. Y eso lo que los economistas dicen es un costo de transacción extra. ¿Qué quiere decir? Se tuvo que frenar el carro porque yo no confiaba en que las reglas del juego iban a ser obedecidas. Esto es lo que llamamos confianza en las instituciones. Entonces, lo primero es que si hay falta de confianza, se reduce, aumentan los costos de transacción, se reduce el motor del desarrollo. Lo segundo tiene que ver con que el desarrollo siempre significa cambio. Y los cambios en general tienen que ser liderados. Alguien lidera esos cambios en las sociedades donde vivimos. Y la pregunta es, ¿tenemos confianza? ¿Qué nivel de confianza tenemos sobre los líderes que llevan adelante esos cambios? Y lo que hemos visto en muchísimos países es que cuando los niveles de confianza sobre el liderazgo que lleva adelante los cambios son bajos, los niveles de resistencia al cambio aumentan muchísimo. Si aumentan los niveles de resistencia, los cambios, las reformas de las que hablaba el secretario esta mañana, no se dan de la manera que uno espera, y entonces el desarrollo se vuelve menos efectivo. Tercer punto para compartir con ustedes es que existe un círculo virtuoso entre ciudadanos y gobiernos cuando la confianza existe. Jorge Familiar, nuestro vicepresidente del Banco Mundial, hablaba de esto hoy cuando hablaba de la oportunidad y la necesidad de generar más ingresos para los estados, ¿sí? Recaudar mejor los impuestos que los ciudadanos pagan. Lo que hemos visto en muchísimos países es que los ciudadanos que no confían en sus instituciones tienden a pagar menos impuestos, porque no saben qué se va a hacer con sus contribuciones. Si los estados tienen menos recaudación, tienen menos capacidad de implementar políticas efectivas. Si tengo menos políticas efectivas, menos resultados, los ciudadanos confían menos en mí y hay un círculo vicioso, una espiral hacia abajo. Si por el contrario, los ciudadanos confían en las instituciones, pagan impuestos, los estados tienen más recursos, con esos recursos producen resultados, esos resultados devienen en producir mayores niveles de confianza que se transforman en mayores niveles de aportes al fisco, con lo cual el Estado tiene más recursos y puede implementar mejores políticas más eficaces, y esa es la base, de alguna manera, del presupuesto basado en resultados. Estas son solo algunas de las preguntas. Nuevamente, el tema que tenemos hoy es de relevancia estratégica para la región, y para eso tenemos realmente un panel de lujo, que ahora voy a presentar. Un panel de lujo no podía ser de otra manera, teniendo hoy la inauguración de la 10ª edición de la conferencia Crecer. Aquí está con nosotros el papá de Crecer, que es Henry Fortin, está aquí en la tercera fila. Si te quieres parar, Henry, si algo sale mal, la culpa va a ser siempre tuya. Pero básicamente ha sido el creador de esta conferencia. Entonces, para presentar al panel que tenemos con nosotros hoy, comenzando con Rachel Grimes, quien fue nombrada presidenta en noviembre del año 2016, tras haber sido vicepresidenta desde el año 2014 y miembro del Consejo del IFAC desde el año 2011. O sea, ella es la presidenta de la International Federation of Accountants, la Federación Internacional de Contadores. Actualmente es directora financiera del Grupo de Finanzas en Tecnología en Westpac Group, una firma multinacional de servicios financieros. Anteriormente, la señora Grimes fue directora de fusiones y adquisiciones en Westpac, siendo contadora certificada con más de 25 años de experiencia en el sector de los servicios financieros. Ha trabajado en Westpac y BT Financial Groups, así como en PwC. Seguido tenemos a Jan Walliser, quien es vicepresidente de prácticas globales del Banco Mundial, que abarca el crecimiento equitativo, las finanzas y las instituciones. Su vicepresidencia es una ventanilla única para ministros de finanzas, gobernadores de bancos centrales y otros altos responsables políticos, ya que brinda la posibilidad de ofrecer a los clientes una amplia gama de opciones en asistencia técnica. Anteriormente, el doctor Walliser fue director de Estrategia y Operaciones del Banco en la región de África. Antes de unirse al Banco Mundial, Jan fue economista del Fondo Monetario Internacional y principal analista en la Oficina de Presupuesto del Congreso de los Estados Unidos, en donde se centró en el análisis de la reforma de la Seguridad Social y la reforma tributaria. El señor Walliser ha publicado en diversas revistas económicas y profesionales sobre aspectos intergeneracionales de la política fiscal, la reforma tributaria, la reforma de pensiones y la eficacia de la ayuda. Recibió un doctorado en Economía de la Universidad de Boston y un Diplom Volkswirt, más o menos así, una licenciatura en Economía por la Universidad de Kiel en Alemania. Más importante que todo esto es que quiero que sepan lo siguiente. Aquí en la audiencia está sentado mi jefe. Mi jefe tiene una jefa y esa jefa tiene un jefe que es Jan. Así que les pido su comprensión durante la mañana de hoy. Seguido de Jan, tenemos sentado a Bill Platt, quien es el director ejecutivo senior en Global Regulatory de Deloitte. Antes de ser nombrado líder global de regulación, Bill fungió como socio ejecutivo nacional de calidad en Deloitte. En dicho puesto, Bill era responsable de encabezar las actividades para el continuo mejoramiento de la calidad de la auditoría. También formó parte del equipo de liderazgo estratégico del comité ejecutivo. Asimismo, es miembro de la Junta Directiva de Deloitte. Bill también es miembro fundador de la Junta Directiva de Calidad de la Auditoría y actualmente funge como su copresidente. Antes de servir como director ejecutivo, Bill fue socio ejecutivo en la práctica profesional en los Estados Unidos. También ha desempeñado diversos cargos en la Oficina Nacional de Estados Unidos, entre los que se encuentra el haber sido socio del SEC Services Group, director nacional de Independencia, director nacional adjunto en servicios de contabilidad y director nacional de contabilidad y consulta de informes. Bill también es presidente del Grupo de Trabajo Regulador del Comité Global de Políticas Públicas, un foro mundial de representantes de las 6 redes internacionales de contabilidad más importantes, donde está BDO, Deloitte, EY, Grant Thornton, KPMG y PwC. Uno de los principales objetivos de la red es participar de manera constructiva en la formulación de políticas públicas a nivel global. Por último, Alberto Vergara es un politólogo peruano que ha recibido un doctorado por parte de la Universidad de Montreal, en Canadá. Actualmente es investigador visitante en el Centro de Estudios Latinoamericanos de la Universidad de Georgetown, en Estados Unidos. Fue investigador de postdoctorado en la Universidad de Harvard, ha impartido una cátedra sobre política latinoamericana en la Universidad de Montreal, en la Universidad de Harvard y en el Instituto de Estudios Políticos de París, en Francia. Su experiencia se centra en diversos aspectos de los regímenes políticos de los países andinos, partidos políticos, política subnacional, elecciones y ciudadanía. Su trabajo ha sido publicado en Latin American Research Review, Journal of Democracy, Journal of Politics in Latin America, entre otros. Su libro más reciente es La danza hostil, poderes subnacionales y Estado central en Bolivia y Perú, del 1952 hasta el 2012, publicado por el Instituto de Estudios Peruanos en el año 2015. Le damos la bienvenida a todos los miembros del panel. Y solo para decirles cómo vamos a estar organizados, vamos a pedirle en unos minutos a Alberto que se acerque al podio, haga una introducción general al tema para que nos ayude a enmarcar la discusión del panel y luego volveremos todos a la mesa y vamos a tener un diálogo entre los panelistas con preguntas y respuestas y ustedes en el público también van a tener la oportunidad de escribir sus preguntas, hacérmelas llegar y presentárselos a los panelistas. Antes de pasar a Alberto, solamente recordarles que este evento es transmitido en vivo por la página de Facebook del Banco Mundial y por la cuenta de Twitter, @Banco Mundial LAC. También será transmitido en vivo en la página web del Banco Mundial, que es bancomundial.org/ALC, como América Latina y el Caribe, y los invitamos a todos a sumarse a la conversación usando el hashtag Crecer2017. Esta transmisión la comparten por sus redes sociales el Instituto Mexicano de Contadores Públicos, la Secretaría de Hacienda de México y la Organización de Estados Americanos, OEA, con lo cual cualquier cosa que ustedes digan en esta sesión podrá ser usada en su contra. Ahora sí, Alberto, te damos la bienvenida para que nos ilustres en unos 15 minutos en una presentación inicial del tema. Muchas gracias a todos. ¿Con eso avanzo? Perfecto.
¿Está el PowerPoint puesto? Sí. Bueno, buenos días, muchísimas gracias por la presentación. Roby, siempre un tremendo gusto estar en México y quiero agradecer a Crecer por invitarme a esta tan estimulante conferencia y al Banco Mundial particularmente por tener la iniciativa, la audacia, diría yo, de invitar a un académico y a un cientista político a participar de esta reunión. No voy a replicar a Roby preguntando cuántos politólogos hay en la sala, me voy a ahorrar esa sensación drástica de soledad, así que muchas gracias por la invitación. En esta presentación intentaré hacer lo que se me encomendó, es decir, presentar un panorama general sobre la relación entre la confianza ciudadana y las instituciones públicas. Mi presentación buscará llamar la atención sobre la desatendida cuestión de la representación política en la calidad institucional. Hace un mes estuve en México para la boda de un querido amigo y cuando llegué el taxista que me sacó del aeropuerto me dijo algo pintado para el inicio de esta conversación. Yo le pregunté, como uno siempre va ahí, lleva la profesión siempre consigo, le pregunto al taxista, le digo, bueno, ¿y cómo va la cosa política en México? Y me dijo algo muy útil para abrir esta conversación. Me dijo, mire, yo nunca voté por Andrés Manuel porque me parecía muy radical, pero ahora voy a votar por él porque o hacemos algo radical en este país o se nos sigue descomponiendo. En realidad usó un vocabulario un poco más colorido que esto, pero les voy a ahorrar los detalles lingüísticos. Es decir, su confesión revela que antes votó por otros candidatos y lo defraudaron. Y el desengaño en su autodescripción lo radicaliza. Votará por una opción que él mismo califica de radical y que en cualquier parte del mundo supone votar por una opción que priorizará el enfrentamiento como forma de avanzar políticas y no la cooperación o el consenso. Esta es la esencia misma de lo que hoy quiero presentar. La frustración ciudadana está asociada a la política del enfrentamiento que a su vez se vincula a una institucionalidad pública de baja legitimidad. Mi amigo taxista no es un sujeto peculiar de Ciudad de México, es un desencantado global, ¿cierto? Eventos recientes han visibilizado la profunda desconfianza de los ciudadanos en sus instituciones políticas a través de decisiones semejantes. Por ejemplo, el Brexit, que ha supuesto un revés serio para lo que era tal vez el esfuerzo cooperativo político más ambicioso y exitoso de la historia contemporánea, la Unión Europea. Y desde luego, Trump, que es el caso perfecto de la política de la desconfianza y el enfrentamiento, ¿cierto? Desconfía abiertamente de todo mecanismo de cooperación, rechaza el NAFTA, denuncia el Acuerdo de París, erosiona la OTAN, critica la Unión Europea y festeja la salida de Inglaterra. En resumen, todo instrumento cooperativo le resulta nocivo. Entre paréntesis, si don Benito Juárez viera esa pancarta se nos vuelve a morir, ¿no? Para quienes aspiramos a un mundo más democrático y más próspero, esta es una muy mala noticia. En la historia, la expansión de la riqueza y la expansión de la democracia han venido generalmente de la mano del desarrollo de instrumentos cooperativos internacionales. Ahora bien, estos eventos de los cuales estamos hablando han hecho que hablemos constantemente de una ola de populismo, de proteccionismo, de retroceso de la democracia, de una ola que parecería ser irreversible y total. Pero en realidad no es así. En Francia el Frente Nacional fue derrotado por amplio margen y ya vieron este tuit del presidente Macron subrayando justamente la política de la cooperación en un tema fundamental. En Austria y Holanda opciones populistas también fueron derrotadas y en América Latina, por poner un ejemplo en la región, el tecnocrático Kuczynski derrotó a una candidata como Keiko Fujimori, heredera de un autoritarismo populista como el de su padre. Es decir, más que un populismo imparable, nos encontramos en un contexto donde dos fuerzas suelen oponerse abiertamente. Para ponerlo en términos muy simples, asistimos al conflicto entre la política centrada en la cooperación, que ve la cooperación como forma de progreso, y otra que ve al progreso como producto del enfrentamiento de una lógica de suma cero. La emergencia de estas formas políticas del enfrentamiento, que han ocupado las primeras planas, es importante subrayarlo, están fundadas en tendencias que vienen de tiempo atrás. Esto no es radicalmente nuevo. Por lo pronto yo me acuerdo que el maestro Octavio Paz escribió alguna vez que en México la gente solo cree en la Virgen de Guadalupe y en la Lotería Nacional, ¿no? Entonces no es que sea algo radicalmente nuevo, viene de una tendencia que hay que estudiar y no creer que esto es simplemente una irrupción repentina. Por ejemplo, miren la confianza, el porcentaje de gente que dice tener muy poca confianza en el Congreso norteamericano. Es una curva ascendente que viene desde atrás, que Trump no inventó. Y fíjense el porcentaje de ciudadanos que acude a votar en las elecciones. También es algo que supera las primeras planas de los últimos meses. Y aquí tenemos un cuadro sobre la confianza en las instituciones en América Latina, en los partidos políticos, en el gobierno y en el Congreso. Entre otras cosas de este gráfico, lo que me gustaría subrayar es que vean cómo el momento de boom económico, en algún sentido, maquilla la desconfianza ciudadana respecto a las instituciones. Pero una vez que el boom comienza a pasar, pareciera que vamos a regresar al business as usual, digamos, de la situación. O fíjense, es la confianza en el Poder Judicial en algunos países de América Latina y Europa. Europa es la línea superior, lo cual demuestra que tampoco es que en Europa la confianza sea enorme. Pero fíjense que hay países, por ejemplo, en momentos en que en Perú o en México, alrededor de solo 10% de la población confía, por ejemplo, en el Poder Judicial. Entonces, cuando la desconfianza en las instituciones se degrada a estos niveles, estas comienzan a carecer de legitimidad. Y la legitimidad es el pegamento último de la institucionalidad pública. Una institucionalidad pública legítima refleja que los ciudadanos confían en que ella está ahí para servir el interés general. En cambio, las instituciones públicas de baja legitimidad sabotean una serie de dimensiones de la vida de un país. Y esto genera un impacto en una serie de dimensiones sobre la cual vamos a conversar en estos días y luego en el panel, así que no voy a abundar en esto, en el impacto. Pero lo importante es, si sabemos que los efectos de la ilegitimidad de las instituciones son dañinos, demos un salto atrás. ¿Por qué ocurre esta erosión de la confianza ciudadana en las instituciones públicas? Como en todo gran fenómeno, obviamente las causas son muchas. Y la que más hemos escuchado en estos últimos meses es esencialmente económica. Las últimas décadas de intenso comercio global trajeron gran riqueza, pero también han dejado perdedores que no se beneficiaron de esto mismo. Entonces, riqueza y desigualdad han despertado en algún sentido la furia ciudadana. No podría negar la importancia de esta tesis y sin duda tiene asidero, pero yo quisiera centrarme aquí en una que ha sido bastante menos mencionada, y es la cuestión de la representación política. La representación política es el eslabón perdido en esta ecuación de desencuentro entre el ciudadano y sus instituciones públicas. En tanto vivimos en regímenes democráticos, el papel de la representación es crucial. Tal vez en un despotismo ilustrado, la institucionalidad pública podría emanar de los designios de un mandamás o de un consejo de sabios. Pero en un régimen democrático, la voluntad que importa es la de la ciudadanía. Y como no vivimos ya en la Atenas donde cualquiera de nosotros hubiera podido ser una autoridad o que se nos podría haber elegido por sorteo, la legitimidad de las instituciones públicas depende de la representación, de los representantes. Es decir, la representación política es el mecanismo que garantiza que el ideal final de la democracia se cumpla. ¿Y cuál es ese ideal? Que la institucionalidad pública refleje la voluntad ciudadana. La representación democrática contiene, vamos a dejarlo, dos elementos básicos: la elección de representantes y luego asegurar que las necesidades y demandas de las sociedades se hagan públicas y se atiendan. Una democracia sana debería cumplir moderadamente bien con ambas. En las últimas décadas, en América Latina, el componente primero de la representación ha mejorado indudablemente. En casi todos nuestros países, las elecciones se convirtieron en la única forma de acceder al poder. Ahora bien, está muy bien elegir a nuestros representantes, pero esa es solo la primera mitad del vínculo representativo. Luego debe legislar, gobernar, haciendo eco de las necesidades sociales. Y aquí es cuando la representación comienza a averiarse. Los partidos políticos han sido y son el instrumento que garantiza que en una democracia se cumplan esos dos elementos básicos de la representación. Generan los cuadros que son elegidos, pero a su vez, en su contacto cotidiano con la sociedad, garantizan que las necesidades sociales sean atendidas por las instituciones. Sin embargo, los partidos han perdido relevancia en muchas partes y resulta sumamente difícil crear nuevos. No voy a aburrirlos con data y cuadros, pero basta decir que el total de votos que reciben los partidos en la mayoría de países se reduce, emergen outsiders, los números de militantes, de afiliados, de gente que participa en las actividades partidarias se reduce en todas partes, y acaso nada demuestre más cuán difícil se ha vuelto la vida partidaria que el desafío enorme que supone hacer sobrevivir a un partido en América Latina. En una investigación reciente, Steve Levitsky y otros colegas de Harvard encontraron que de los 307 partidos que se crearon en América Latina entre el 78, entre el 78 y el 2005, 307, que al menos, además es otra restricción, hubieran recibido al menos 1% en una elección, de ese universo, solo 11 lograron consolidarse como partido político. Entonces, la pregunta es, ¿qué ocurre en estos días que erosiona el vínculo representativo? Más que un problema de buena voluntad de los partidos, de los políticos o de los ciudadanos, estamos en realidad ante un momento de tantas y tamañas transformaciones sociales, económicas, políticas, que todo junto, un poco para usar la categoría de James y Scott, la sociedad se ha hecho difícil de leer. En mis investigaciones encuentro que los ciudadanos se preguntan, ¿a mí quién diablos me representa? Pero también cuando hablo con políticos con angustia semejante me dicen, ¿y yo a quién diablos represento? ¿Cierto? Y entonces lo que quisiera subrayar aquí es alguna de estas transformaciones que hay que entender para poder repensar ese eslabón perdido de la representación. Entonces, hay una sociedad, en general, nuestras sociedades que se van desestructurando, un proceso de fragmentación. Para poner un ejemplo, en Francia hace unas décadas había varias decenas de fábricas que albergaban al menos 10.000 trabajadores. Hoy solo quedan 3 fábricas que albergan ese número de empleados. Entonces hay la caída del mundo de la fábrica ha generado una desestructuración, sobre todo en el lado de los partidos de izquierda, que siempre tuvieron en los sindicatos y la fábrica un espacio desde el cual crecer. Y algo semejante se podría decir de las democracias cristianas y la iglesia. La gente dejó de ir a la iglesia y por lo tanto dejaron de recibir, de heredar los activos que generaba esa institución social. Y en América Latina ese fenómeno se agrava por la informalidad. En muchos países se ha incrementado aceleradamente el porcentaje de ciudadanos en la informalidad, lo cual hace muy difícil encuadrarlos, integrarlos, representarlos, agregar intereses. Es decir, la sociedad solía estar organizada de una manera, en grupos sociales, en organizaciones que facilitaban a los partidos la posibilidad de reconocer y representar, y eso ha cambiado aceleradamente. De otro lado, hay algo que comienzo a llamar la individualización de las agendas, que se refiere a la emergencia de individuos que, potenciados por las nuevas tecnologías, desarrollan reclamos y agendas muy precisas y personales, que no adhieren a grandes ideologías. Con mi colega Juan Pablo Luna hemos llamado a esto la emergencia del single issue citizen, ¿no? Alguien que es claramente favorable está contra el aborto, está contra el maltrato animal, está ese tipo de interés, de agenda sumamente puntual, también le hace la vida más difícil a los partidos que por definición en general tratan de construir plataformas, ideologías integradoras, y estos individuos desde luego son más libres y autónomos, pero también suponen un desafío a la representación. Corrupción en instituciones, de esto vamos a hablar también, desde los 80 en Italia hasta el Brasil de hoy. Los escándalos de corrupción han minado los sistemas representativos y, paradójicamente, muchas veces como consecuencia del buen funcionamiento del Poder Judicial. Es ahí donde a veces es la prueba de que no todo lo bueno viene junto, ¿cierto? Hay puede haber estas consecuencias inesperadas de ciertas mejoras. Y finalmente, la tecnocratización de la política, que este es también un debate donde no sabemos dónde está el punto medio. Es decir, no queremos países donde las políticas públicas estén 100% sujetas al vaivén de la política y por tanto marcadas por la imprevisibilidad, pero lo opuesto también es un problema. Si el mundo de la institucionalidad pública queda definido por planes, indicadores y objetivos de tecnócratas no elegidos, los políticos tienen menos margen de maniobra y por tanto la ciudadanía se ve alejada de sus instituciones públicas. Y este proceso último me parece que ha sido común a varios países latinoamericanos en los últimos años. Entonces, en esta sección quería mostrar algunas de las transformaciones sociales y políticas que han gradualmente alejado representantes de representados. Sin el vínculo representativo, el ciudadano de una democracia se siente ajeno a sus instituciones públicas, y sin el vínculo representativo, las instituciones pierden de vista al destinatario último de sus efectos, el ciudadano. La representación, entonces, es el eslabón perdido de este divorcio peligroso. Y ahora sí, termino con una idea final. Pierre Rosanvallon, un politólogo francés, ha escrito que una sociedad mal representada oscila entre la pasividad y el miedo. Habrá que agregar que el correlato institucional de esto es que poseerá una institucionalidad pública que oscila entre la inercia y la incapacidad para cooperar. Entonces, hoy nos falta ser más imaginativos y construir, inventar una suerte de radar de necesidades, quejas, malestares sociales que no estamos identificando, que no llegan a la esfera pública y por lo tanto tampoco logran ser representados políticamente. Ahora sí, termino. Las transformaciones y dificultades de la vida representativa que he presentado aquí, desde luego, no son la única fuente de debilidad o ineficacia de nuestras instituciones. Pero sí estoy convencido que si no le otorgamos un lugar privilegiado en los debates como estos sobre políticas públicas, sobre crecimiento económico o sobre el desarrollo, estamos dejando de lado una pieza central de los problemas, pero también de las posibilidades que tienen nuestros países. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias Alberto, y vamos a pasar ahora en la siguiente hora que nos queda, o hora y un poquitito más, a un diálogo entre los integrantes del panel, incluido Alberto también, y con el resto de los comentaristas de esta conferencia, que son todos los aquí presentes, unas 250 personas que están aquí sentadas, que también tendrán la oportunidad, como ustedes pueden ver, de llenar una ficha con preguntas puntuales. Me van a disculpar si algunas de las preguntas las hago en inglés, aprovechando que algunos de los expositores hablan inglés, es su lengua de preferencia, y tenemos traducción simultánea en todo caso para todos, ¿verdad? ¿Todos tienen la traducción? ¿Sí? Muy bien. So let me start the panel with a question for Jan. And the question, Jan, is what role does public trust in public institutions play in fostering growth and achieving development objectives? And why the international community should care about this?
Thank you very much, and thank you first of all for the presentation, and also it's a pleasure to be here at this 10th anniversary of Crescer. I think, and I apologize that I had to have to switch languages, but if I try to speak anything else but English or German, it's French, and then I'm afraid that you won't have that translation either. So, but I wanted to say a few words on our perspective on the trust issue, and I think to just illustrate how important it is for public institutions to function. I think if you go to the very principles of, it's an economics example that's very easy, that's often used. It's around the issue of cash and money, and of trusting central banks that they will honor obligations. When you hold a dollar bill or a peso bill, it's worth almost nothing, but you're willing to accept it for payment, and the same thing applies now for electronic payment systems. When somebody gives you a Visa card or somebody gives you a MasterCard or any other card, a credit card, you are able to, you believe in that there is credit behind it, that there's credibility behind it, that there's a system behind it that will pay you eventually, even if it's somebody who's not from your own country or who doesn't live there. So trust in the first instance in economic activity is very important, and actually it fuels economies and makes sure that economies can function. Now, when you go to translate that to the public institutions, there's a huge element, I think we heard it also from the introductory presentation, of relationships that citizens have with their government that are very important. So when you are paying taxes, you're typically expecting a service in return. And when that relationship breaks down, you get systems where you get low equilibria, where people are not interested in paying taxes. They may be forced to pay taxes, but they try everything to avoid paying taxes when they see that there is no service that comes in return. And then it also is when we look globally, that's a relationship, and poor relationships and trust in government that then foster downward spirals even into situations of fragility. When you look at our poorest countries that are ranked on our fragile country list, they typically have tax to GDP ratios that are in the low teens or below 10%, certainly below 15%. Often you find that in these situations, government services don't inspire trust. Security is not sufficient. There's no focus by government on actually providing the security services for their citizens either. And then you get into a situation where you get a self-reinforcing mechanisms where governments are not able to actually control their territory. The citizens don't want to actually participate in the institutions that government represents, and they don't feel comfortable in these circumstances. So that's sort of the worst outcome of a downward spiral of trust getting lost. And in that circumstance, it's quite clear that if you need to build that trust, a lot of pieces of trust are evolving around information and accurate information, and information in the way it's being provided by government. Can you trust government that is telling you what actually occurred? Are events actually being described in a way that everybody agrees in the way that they happened? Is it that data that is being provided in the statistics offices follows standards that are internationally accepted, that can be verified? I think there are, we've had cases where there have been long disputes about inflation rates and other economic variables that were produced by statistics offices. So these are core elements of building trust with citizens and the participation in institutions. And they start with often with a good understanding of a common denominator in the way in which data is produced. And just a final word, I think one of the things, even with my limited Spanish, the one thing that came through in almost all the presentation that we heard this morning and in the opening was rendición de cuentas. So everybody has to give account for what they do, and it's not only in the numbers but also literally. And I think it's a very important piece that's being done in a format and in a way that's understandable, can be easily communicated, and that citizens can understand for them to invest in their countries and participate in public decision making. Thank you.
So you get applauses too. Yeah, that's very impressive. Maybe we should stop there, so just in case. No. So basically, a follow-up question is, you already established the importance of this agenda for development and why the international community should care about this. What should be the role of institutions like the World Bank or other institutions that play at the global level regarding this agenda?
Well, I think the interesting part of that is that we have 189 member countries. So we have a very wide reach in the way as a global institution. And when you want to set standards, often those with low capacity that want to adopt the standards want to know where they can find the means to do so. And so we've found ourselves often in the role to, first of all, review the standards and codes that countries are using to make sure that they are, in the first instance, consistent with good practice, but then also found ourselves in the situation to facilitate the adoption of strong standards and codes and international financial accounting standards, or whether we actually have a partnership now we're working with IOSCO and others that are setting standards around the world. And then we are applying that in our country dialogue and our relationships with, through technical assistance. And it's very helpful to actually have that relationship with the standard-setting bodies, because that way you are getting truly a very far reach on the applicability of these standards, but also we are incorporating them in the way we're carrying the dialogue with our partner countries and client countries. Thank you.
Thank you, Jan. So, Rachel, question for you. What role could the accounting profession play in fostering trust, increasing effective audit increasing accountability in the use of public funds, and ensuring ethical practices in financial reporting? And based on what Alberto just presented, I want to add something else, which is, can you guys bring political legitimacy as a glue that brings together society?
There's some big questions in that. Thank you, and I'm also delighted to be here, and on behalf of IFAC, thrilled that we've maintained this relationship and been part of CRESER for the last 10 years. We regard this as a very important forum, so thank you very much for putting me on this panel. And delightful to be in Mexico City. I've never been here before, but it's been fantastic. Well, that is a big question, so let me try and address that. Firstly, in terms of trust, accountants love measuring things, and I think that our relationship with the Edelman organisation and the Edelman Trust Barometer is really crucial, because they have data for 2 decades that show that we are the lowest point of trust in the history of their testing. And that has major implications for everyone around the world. And I think there's a couple of other measures for me that are just as important as well. I think JP Morgan's mergers table is really important as well, their M&A table. And what we've seen is that in 2015, that was a peak year for M&A, for global transactions. And as Brexit occurred and all the data points that have been put forward this morning, in fact, I think that it really started in the Philippines with the populist government being elected there, then Brexit. My own country, Australia, in September had issues in terms of this, and then obviously November elections in the United States meant that the confidence has gone in a lot of the major boardrooms around the world. And again, that's reflected in the data for 2017 to date. For my own company and organisation, the level of trust is a really important one, and we've measured it for 10 years in that who does the small practitioner, who does the small customer go to in the first instance when they seek advice? It's not the banker, it's not their lawyer, it's not their fund manager, it's not their financial planner, it's their accountant. And I think that's a really, really important data point for us. And the other measure in confidence is how much are people prepared to borrow? And it's really hard to get a very broad piece on that. But as I work at a bank, I look at that data very importantly from many of the central banks around the world, and that's also, to me, the 4th indicator of trust. In terms of what accountants could do, I think it's more about what we are doing. And I'm delighted to see that we have some very strong characters in the room. I'm former chair of IPSASB. I'm not sure if I've got the current chair in the room, but oh yes, I do. Hello, Mr. Carruthers, up the back there. And also, with that is a really important piece, and the work that that committee is doing, that board is doing, is crucial to making people accountable. And that's a key component in the first instance. And the other piece that I don't want to leave out, the Ethics Standards Board, because is Stavros here as well? No? I haven't got him here. But ethics is the very thing that underpins our profession. It sets us apart. And the more that we concentrate on ethics, the better that will be. So I don't think it's a amount of could do, it's what we are doing in that piece.
Thank you very much, Rachel. And Bill, we spoke about the accounting profession, we spoke about international development organizations. Let's talk a little bit about the audit and regulation sphere. So what's the importance of regulation for the audit profession? And how would a more effective audit regulation environment help to strengthen the role of auditors, particularly in terms of their contribution to sustainable economic growth? Related to this also is what Alberto just presented in the last slide about corruption or perception of corruption. How does this perception of corruption affect the regulatory function as well.
All excellent questions. And first, let me thank you for the opportunity to be here and to participate on behalf of the GPPC firms in the creation of this event and this conference. On behalf of my colleagues in the 6 large networks, we had the opportunity 10 years ago, as the conference was being developed in 2017, due to the vision, or sorry, 2007, due to the vision of the World Bank and the Inter-American Development Bank and IFAC, who were working on creating the conference and had the vision of what this could be and what they wanted it to be, and that vision has certainly been achieved, came to the profession to seek sponsorship and to seek speakers. The profession was intrigued and felt that the objectives of what the organizers were attempting to achieve was something that was extremely positive. And we as a profession said we don't want to just be sponsors, we want to also be organizers. And so we've had the privilege over the past 10 years of working with the organizers of this event to continue to create the annual events and conferences that have been held during that time. So on behalf of the profession, I thank all of you. Back to your questions, and I think about this broad aspect of trust and trust for sustainable growth as being a key in today's world and a great theme for the conference this year in light of the comments that have been made by many of the speakers to date, and especially what Rachel just talked about, the trust barometer and its state in the current environment. But I think if we take a step back and if we think about trust, trust isn't something that's just granted or bestowed on individuals or organizations or information. Trust is something that's earned. And it usually is just not a single party that can earn trust. It needs to be a collaborative effort to earn that trust. And then also think about all those good things that we all do in our lives to earn trust. And we might do 1,000 great things that are all trust-building worthy. And then we have one failure. And that one failure out of 1,000 disproportionately erodes the level of trust from public confidence and public perception. It has a destructive effect that one failure wipes out 1,000 good things that you did before that. So trust is something that we need to work on each and every day and on everything that we do each and every day. Also, we see a world that's more global today than ever, and a world in which incidents that happen anywhere in the world can move around the world in terms of recognition and prominence, and therefore destroy trust across the globe, rather than just in their local jurisdiction or local environment. There are some things we'll carve out and say, well, that was just jurisdiction A or political environment B, but many things have this sort of global impact as trust eroding events. So for that reason, it's very important that we build a cohesive network of regulation and performance standards across the globe for not only for auditors, but, and I'm going to talk mostly as I talk here about the private sector as opposed to the public sector. But in the private sector, you think about the trust ecosystem, as I might call it, and the trust ecosystem in that private sector certainly includes auditors. It includes companies and their management themselves that are preparing and disseminating data and information, conducting transactions. It includes those in charge of governance, whether they're boards or audit committees, and what's their oversight over the activities of the organization, as well as its reporting and transparency. And then last but not least, most important is regulatory environment, both around companies, their conduct, their reporting, and auditors and their conduct and reporting. And I think with many of the things we've done, that the world today is a lot different than it was 10 years ago when this conference was started. And we do have more consistency and application of standards for financial reporting on a global basis. We have more consistency in the application of auditing standards. We have more consistency in the application of ethical principles and standards across the globe. And I say more, not meaning that I declare victory on it, but we're farther advanced than we ever were before, and it's time to actually move forward in creating greater global consistency in it. I would say also, think about the time, is that often we create environments that were perfect solutions for yesterday's problems. We live in a world today that's changing so rapidly that we have to think about, is there ways to build trust in what I would call either the technology or information revolution that we're in today, rather than destroy trust. You know, it's sort of interesting, as many of you flew here, probably, I didn't see many hands of people who drove to the conference here. Just think about it. Was it more important to you that the engines on the plane were manufactured by either Rolls-Royce or Pratt & Whitney, or is it more important to you that they were in perfect operating order? And if you knew when the last time they were maintained was, would that be important to you? If you knew there was constant monitoring of parts on a plane to tell when they were about to fail and they were nearing end of life and that they were fixed before they failed, wouldn't that be more valuable to you than just knowing who manufactured it? And we're moving into a world where I think information and data may actually be more valuable than the tangible products that they relate to. And how do we, as regulators, as governments, as profession, deal with that in making sure there's not an erosion of trust in this exploding amounts of data and information? So just some basic thoughts as I think about the role of trust, the role of the profession, and kind of how we all can work together collaboratively to help rebuild trust in private entities.
So collaboration is a good word, it's a big word, and easier to say than to do, right? And so Alberto, in the opening remarks, Jorge Familiar spoke about the emergence of a new middle class in Latin America. He spoke also about the new social contract that is happening in our countries in Latin America, or could take place in Latin America. So I would like your reflections on what do you think is the role of this emerging middle class? What is the impact of this emerging middle class in this discussion? And how can they collaborate with, more traditional functions of the international organizations, the auditors, the regulators, and the accountants in this field?
Well, my sense is that so it is normal that we have a lot of hope in these new strong middle classes, but the first thing is that we don't really know if they are that strong, right? Part of that strong new middle class is a bit precarious, so that would be a first. In the case of any trouble, parts of that new middle class could step back into poverty, right? So that's first thing. The second is that I think the impact of these new middle class agendas or social activity has an uneven impact in the continent. I would say that it's clear that for example, in Chile, in Brazil, these new middle classes have taken a prominent role in calling for more accountability, let's say they have played this role of social accountability. I don't find something similar in the Andean countries where also there is this emerging new middle class. It seems that it is not a priority, or it's not well organized, or it should be related to informality perhaps. And in other countries like Mexico, I would say I see a lot of mobilization and new middle classes organized and asking for agendas related to different sorts of accountability. My sense is that contrary to Brazil and Mexico, I feel that, and I hope I'm not making any big mistake here, but my sense is that the Mexican political system is more hermetic than the other ones. And so maybe civil society is having troubles in actually including those agendas and the political system in accepting them. I would say that maybe the general situation it's uneven. That would be my answer to that interesting question.
Thank you, Alberto. Jan, you mentioned before, you gave a very tangible example of an institution, which is the dollar, right? And then you spoke also about international standards for public sector accounting. When countries are not up to the game, can they import institutions from other countries? And what is the impact of that decision in terms of strengthening their own country systems and institutions? And what could be the best sequencing for this to happen?
No, thank you, Robbie, for that question. It's an interesting question, right? From the, you can do it, but it constrains you, and it always can create situations of sovereignty. So if you look at the post-colonial history of Africa, for example, you had the creation of the two central banks that were maintaining a parity with the French franc originally, and then with the euro, and they, of course, are institutions that that zone has had very low inflation for ever since independence. So it didn't go through any of the fluctuations that some of the other African countries had post-independence in terms of macroeconomic volatility around the monetary issues. But if you look from that perspective, you can adopt the institution, but it of course constrains your own decision making. So it ends up with, in some ways, a decision where you're saying, in return for importing something that's set up elsewhere or that has an external anchor, I'm making sure that then I'm giving up some of my sovereign decision making. A similar issue is if you're fixing your exchange rate more generally, you are essentially attaching yourself to decision making abroad in terms of the monetary policy, because then you have to adjust all the time on the fiscal side to maintain that parity and to maintain the credibility, and it creates, as you will know from your own country, Robbie, then an issue of when that link is broken, then you may have much higher economic turmoil because you're losing suddenly the faith in that institution. That was because you weren't able to maintain it. So it's a double-edged sword. So you can do it in other ways, of course. I think what I refer to as sort of as a middle ground is as if you take this type of international standard setting. You know, if you're adopting, for example, the way in which you prepare the fiscal statements according to IMF standards, it's not something it's in some ways constraining, but in many ways it's actually just a good practice that allows you to compare that allows everybody to compare whatever happens in your fiscal accounts with what happened in fiscal accounts in other countries, and you use the same nomenclature and that's why using the same international accounting standards, for example, is very important, because you're creating the trust that what is being stated is being relevant and is being trustworthy for investors that may come and that may go, and it doesn't have the same level of. It's not a full institution that you're adopting, right? Because you're still having to build your own framework around it and train people, and it's actually locally implemented. But it's a standard that you're adopting, and I see that as somewhat in the middle. It doesn't. It offers a way in which you can maintain, if you wish, information systems that are internationally acceptable and that are understood. But it still allows you actually to operate within your own capacity and within your own decision making. So you have sort of a range of options in between that you can decline from sort of zero, doing everything your own way, to adopting something that's entirely imported, and then you have things that are in the middle that are essentially agreements across borders of how to do things in the same way, so that everybody speaks the same language and understands each other.
Thank you, Jan. And I think that your observation is very relevant for many of our countries, where we need to strike a balance between what is that we import from other countries and what is that we develop ourselves. And you can think of examples of countries adopting the dollar as their currency. You can think of countries where citizens don't believe public sector or official statistics, and then they bring these statistics from international organizations, or when they rely on international courts for arbitrage of domestic issues, for example, right? So all these points out to the need for strengthening local institutions, and sometimes countries rely maybe too heavily on importing institutions from others, but the key here is to strike, as you said, Jan, the right balance on this. Bill, you mentioned that trust has basically two sides, right? So it's not that you can produce trust, you have to earn it. And if you need to earn it, somebody needs to actually believe in you, somebody needs to trust you. So this means that you have two sides to the equation. So this question is both for you and for Rachel, in terms of your perception on how much citizens do trust auditors, regulators, accountants, especially after some still fresh scandals involving some of the leading auditing agencies in the world.
Yes, that's an excellent question, and clearly something that those of us in the profession wake up every day thinking about, what am I doing to earn trust today, and are people recognizing it? Do we have people that appreciate it? And there's no doubt that a financial reporting scandal erodes trust. And as I mentioned before, it doesn't erode trust just in a country. It actually erodes trust across the globe. I would say that I think that there is greater trust on the audit profession than maybe many other sources, and I see Cindy Fornelli sitting back there. Cindy's done some surveys around trust of auditors, and we generally get, a fairly high score compared to other people, but still probably not good enough, I guess I would say. If I can, if somebody, you take the chain that Alberto had up there before, it could have just been one link in 1,000 feet of the chain. But if you were going to trust your life to hang on that chain, you probably didn't care it was one link in 1,000 feet of the chain, because the chain didn't achieve its purpose. And so I think, whenever you have something that's not very, very high, you end up with worrying about the erosion of confidence and trust. And Rachel, I'll let you comment a little bit from an IFAC standpoint, what you see around the globe.
Thank you, Bill. In terms of this, I think you're absolutely right, and I think it's really important for all of us to ensure that all parts of the value chain are working together. So I'm a preparer of the accounting information in Australia, and I must do my very best, as I hope that internal audit that review my work does their very best, that the compliance teams within my bank do their very best, and that the auditors then do their best, and that they're auditing, in the guidelines of, the truly global profession, the accounting profession within their standards, and applying each of those, as well as, of course, the ethics standards, is key. So each one of us must take responsibility when we see any negative press in the accounting piece, and how do we strive to get better. And I think your question really is about the citizens, and the citizens must have confidence in the financial markets, and they do when they see that it's a set of audited accounts. And they're much more willing to invest. And I can tell you, a lot of boards are more willing to invest when they see an audited set of accounts. So we all play a role right across the piece, but I think citizens have a great deal more confidence when they see that accountants are the key parts of every component of the value chain.
So talking about citizens, Alberto, the question is whether citizens can play a role in this game in terms of becoming themselves auditors and collaborating with the role and the work of supreme audit institutions, for example. Can we have a coalition of civil society-based auditing, social accountability practices, together with public sector accountability systems?
Yes, I think so. And not only in that sector, for example, in terms of their direct impact on public policy, for example. I remember once I interviewed a Minister of Interior Security, and he said, how can I have good public policy on my sector? If I cannot rely on data? And I cannot rely on data because citizens don't go to the police commandancia headquarters to say anything when they have suffered, when they were robbed or suffered any crime. So sometimes I don't even have the input from citizens because they are afraid to go to the police or to the judiciary. So it's not only even sometimes in non let's say, they have a played role permanently, not just as a coalition. And as a coalition, I think it's clear that it's been working in several places at least in Latin America. I would say that several reforms in Chile have responded to citizens' demands. So yes, of course, they can be part of broad coalitions.
Yeah, you're nodding. You wanted to add something to this?
Yeah, I just was
Right.
going to observe on that, is you might say today, we actually do live in a world where public citizens have a loud voice. Just think about social media and tweets, and I think the real challenge with that is for the millions of small pieces of information that come out. How do you know which ones are true, and which ones should be a concern, and which ones are just somebody just felt they can just put 10 words out that criticize something. And I do think that that's probably something for us all to think about, is when the world today, public perception is driven by sound bites and driven by emotion, not driven by facts, is how do we translate facts into emotion and sound bites so that we can build, in the general public, the confidence that should be deserved in an area, rather than just letting the destructive noise of sound bites go out there, countered with 30-page reports with deep data that nobody reads.
But also, it requires probably a change in the relationship between citizens and governments, and moving beyond an antagonistic relationship to a collaborative one. And we've seen, at least in developing countries, maybe much more than in developed countries already, this collaboration where citizens not only inform about, sometimes misprocurement or misbehavior in public institutions, but they also help public sector institutions improving their practices. And we've seen citizens working with supreme audit institutions together, not just to inform, but also to make sure that the recommendations of these supreme audit institutions have more traction in terms of implementing these recommendations later on. You wanted to add something to this, Rachel?
I just wanted to say that we must recognise that the auditors have, many years of experience and study. And so we can't underplay the importance of that skill set, and that whether they're on the Public Interest Oversight Board, we need experts that understand audit and the value chain piece, and we can't underestimate it, just as I would not try to fix my own car or cut my own hair. So we need experts in that space, and we can't replace them with the ordinary public on many occasions. We need to turn to the experts, and they're key to the success of the confidence and the trust in the financial system.
All right. Yeah.
Just to add, I think it's very important that you get this relationship that I think this, what Bill just mentioned, I think that you get a lot more information that can be crowdsourced through social media now. I mean, everybody who uses Waze knows that it's essentially, you can share information about yourself that helps everybody else because it calculates where is the fastest way to drive. Mm-hmm. But if you are having that relationship, could potentially also work with governments, right? That's a lot of pieces of information are being provided, but it requires governments to also act on that information and to process that information and to insert it into their own decision making and adjusting the way in which they respond to citizens. So it doesn't help me a whole lot that I can, living in the District of Columbia in the United States in Washington, it doesn't help me a lot that I can report that my sidewalk is broken when 1 year later my sidewalk is still broken, right? So you're actually then losing trust that anybody will respond on these social media platforms. So you have a nice app, you can report a pothole and everything that you see on the way. You have crowdsourcing, but then you also need the systems that analyze it and feed it back into then government decision making and have responsive agencies that sit behind it.
But just think about, you mentioned Waze, and let's assume you bought a house on a quiet street somewhere in the Metro Washington area. Before Waze, and now Waze is out there, and everybody is taking the detour right in front of your house and you now live on a very busy, noisy street. And so you think about, the consequences of data and information. For every person it helps, it may actually hurt somebody else in thinking about that. You may value destruction in a way as a homeowner, but if you're the driver of a car, you view value creation through an app like that.
So Rachel, I buy your argument, right? So you have to be an expert, you have to have the tools. Still, you can collaborate with other parts of society. So all of that I buy. Now, I think that you guys have a big challenge. And the challenge I see is that, let me phrase this in a question. What to do when the audit reports do not trigger government response? Because for a citizen, you have the report there, right? And you don't know all the internal, schmoozing and machinery of the government to understand what it is that they do with the report. So you may lose credibility as well when that report is not acted upon. So what to do when governments do not act upon the report that you produce?
Well, I think that's all of us, again, that we need to take ownership of that. And being a preparer, I'm very conscious of what the auditors write, be it in the client letter or in now the extended audit report. So I think that we, as the accountants, must take ownership as well, and we can't just give it over to government. We've got to stand up and take that responsibility in order to build trust. And if an item is called out as a management issue, a control issue, then I must take responsibility to fix it. I don't think the government has to do that, but the government must enforce some of these things. And we need to work together with government and smart regulation to make things happen so that citizens are not negatively impacted. But we must stand up, put our hand up and take ownership.
And I think that maybe in addition to this, what the Secretary mentioned this morning, the role that transparency needs to play. So if the audit reports are fully transparent and disclosed, then citizens and the media will have maybe better chances to understand who does what and where the responsibility lies. Jan, I have two questions for you from the audience, right? So one says, I will translate this, what should be, from your perspective, the most effective way and fastest way for governments to recover public trust from citizens? And the second question is, what are the IFIs, the international finance institutions, doing to support private audit firms, especially in the area of procurement?
So let me talk about the recovering trust. I think we've touched on a couple of these pieces, right? One of them is, I think, is this part of producing data in a way that it's clear that it's at arm's length from government and that it's being produced regularly and it can be seen by everyone, and so it's public. It's produced in a professional way, so meaning that if there are international standards out there that they are being adhered to, and it can be independently verified and it has credibility. And I think that is really the foundation. We found that often a lot of conversations that we have with governments are on poverty data, where you have to sometimes use a lot of techniques to produce the data in a consistent way and compare them across many years from household surveys, and it's not always easy. And it's really, really important that these not only be produced professionally, but also being put out with very good explanations, because these tend to be highly political as some of the other numbers. We all know how important it is that the fiscal deficit is being reported consistently and in a way that can be verified for various reasons. All international bond investors and government bonds will watch to this being a number that is being produced in a reliable fashion. So there's these parts, I think, where it's just a fundamental principle. And I think there are a couple of ways in which things are happening around open government partnership. We had 1.5 years ago, we had the summit here in Mexico City for that, which is a self-commitment device for governments to show how they are actually not only producing data, but putting it out. And interestingly, what's sometimes forgotten, there's actually also a review mechanism in the OGP. And when you look at, when we were at the Paris summit last fall, the peer review actually doesn't look particularly good on the implementation of some of these measures. And that's another mechanism in which citizens actually can even hold governments accountable on, that's what you said, that's what you're going to do. And look, you signed up to this OGP and not much is happening. On procurement, this is a more technical issue. On the procurement side, we're just in the process of rolling out a new World Bank procurement framework, which is getting away from just a direct assessment of only lowest bidder in all cases, but actually applies some judgment in terms of value for money. And one of the things that we're trying to do in the process is also to systematize the tracking of the procurement process through a database, so that we have actually information of where things stand at each point in time. There is, in some of our regions, we have specific initiatives to actually interact with small and medium enterprises to help them compete on contracts that governments put out. But keep in mind that we are the facilitator, or that we are supporting a process that governments are actually undertaking. World Bank projects are implemented by governments, so we're under certain rules that we set that they have to comply with, but the ultimate way is that we're trying to build the capacity in government to actually be responsive and interact with the public or the sectors that are interested in governments through strengthening the capacity of governments around the procurement processes.
Thank you, Jan. Bill, ready for a couple of questions yourself? Yeah? So one says, I need to translate this one, it says the degree of supervision and regulation of the financial sector is asymmetric between North America and South America. This produces different ethical behaviors, some of them to be dubious, and so some of them are accepted in the South while not accepted in the North. So in this particular case, what should be the role of the public accounting and auditing? So basically what the person is describing here is two situations, a behavior that is ethical in South America may not be ethical in North America. So how do you go about that one? And the other one is, who regulates the regulators? This can be extended to who audits the auditors and who controls the controllers, right? But Bill.
So two very interesting questions, and as someone who operates in a global network, I get asked the question is how do I drive consistency of execution and our professionals acting in a professional way in all countries of the world. And just give you a perspective, I mean, if we take the GPPC member firms, we employ 1 million people collectively across the world. So just think about that, 1 million people in every country, all across the world, virtually every country. And how we would deal with that is we actually would come up with what we believe is, what I would say is a firm-specific expectation on ethical conduct and behavior. And I think, Rachel talked before about the importance of ethics for the profession through international ethics standards that would apply in every country across the globe, not just in those countries in which certain things were ethical or not ethical. So I do think that driving consistency is important. I didn't mention before, you talked about who oversees the regulators, but I didn't have a chance yet to mention that as a profession, we are supportive of independent auditor regulation. We think that a strong regulator with the right skills and with the right activities, which would include inspections and other things, is actually accretive to the value that the profession provides. You'll hear in the next panel conversations about the international form of independent audit regulators, but it gives an opportunity for audit regulators around the world to exchange in a dialogue of how they regulate the profession in individual countries. And I encourage more of that to happen. We're seeing that happening not only across the globe, but we're seeing regional collaboration among regulators too. Ultimately, I think regulators are overseen by all of us, by the general public. They're generally either government agencies or quasi-government agencies, and I think have the same issues with respect to trust. that we talk about generally about public institutions.
Very good. So, Jan, one more question for you is, why should the private sector care about this agenda? Isn't this agenda of growth, but mostly than that, more than that, the agenda of trust in public institutions, a public sector agenda? Bill says no, 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 no.
Well, maybe the two, Rachel and Bill, who flanked me, can help me in answering that question, because I think they see it certainly all the time, the overlapping agenda. For us, if you know that development doesn't happen just in the public sector. So if you don't have an interacting and interface where this, the standard setting and the way in which you provide information creates also credibility around private sector activity, then you're not going to get integrating yourself into a global economy is going to be extremely difficult. And that's ultimately where the success often lies, right? Is sort of what you do locally has to connect in some ways with something else that happens internationally or globally for you to be economically expand and to be able to exchange goods and services across borders. And without that, I think, and that is facilitated if you get cross-border investments, if you create capital markets that attract foreign investors to your country and foreign saving that helps you grow faster. And none of this happens without credibility of your fundamental accounting frameworks and the standards that you're applying. And nobody wants to go and invest in the black hole and not knowing whether they can trust what is being produced by the accounts that they're seeing and in which accountability is exercised to shareholders or to investors through these documentation of what happened in financial statements.
Yeah, and I would say I'll talk about this both from, an audit profession standpoint and then from, a private sector standpoint in terms of capital formation and also business activities. But I'll start with the audit profession. Without trust, the audit reports that we issue are valueless. They have no value. And so without us building trust in that report, in essence, we should just hang up our shingles and go home and stop practicing. So trust is the core principal foundation issue. We get there through ethics and standards and performance and quality control systems and all those kinds of things. But without trust, we end up with a valueless product. Also, and some people may have seen this, the AAA, which is the American it's the academic community across the globe, had a commission they created called the Pathways Commission, and they created a really nice depiction and story about the value of credible information. And in essence, what they would say is that data and information really is a starting point for each and every business decision that's made by a private entity. Do I hire an employee? I need some data to know that's a good decision to make. Do I buy product? Do I design something for the future? Do I sell something? What price do I use? And that the better, the higher quality of data, the more you can rely on it, in essence, fuels the economic system. It fuels the private companies themselves in doing transactions. So it goes beyond capital raising. Capital raising is very important itself. But each and every economic transaction that a company engages in is based upon information and by the people who are making those decisions, trust in that information. Rachel works in a company. She's generating information that her management is making decisions on each and every day, each second of every day. And if that was not trustworthy information, they would either go into paralysis or they'd be making a lot of bad decisions.
If I could just come back to the previous question on the regulators, who regulates the regulators? And I think it's really important that we understand that everyone in this room operates in the public interest, not just the regulators. And their definition of public interest sometimes differs from ours in terms of the changes that they propose. So, I believe that this is is the most ethical profession, and we need to really grab hold of that, because I know so many of you in this room give so much time to charities, to organisations that you help, and it's the very basis of what we do as accountants. And so we are operating the public interest every day, I know it, and so for the regulators to say that they are, we need to put them to account much more than they are. So I just wanted to add to that.
So it is time to be wrapping the panel. So I have one final question for each one of you. And in addition to that, you'll have the chance to give us any thought that you have in your mind about today's session. So for you, Rachel, the question will be, what do you see as the main challenges in terms of the new generation of accountants in the world? For you, Jan, the question will be that we have built this panel and this conference under the assumption that trust in public institutions is very important for economic growth. But we have seen countries that also have produced economic growth with very low levels of trust in public institutions. So how do you reconcile these two? Bill, the question for you will be, what will be the safeguards that you need to put in place to make sure that you can not just regain, but retain the trust, the public trust in your type of organizations? And Alberto, finally, are you sure that, really sure, that trust in public institutions cannot happen when you don't have political representation? Because your presentation was very much about democratic and liberal democracy type of approach, but not every country in the world has that. And legitimacy and trust in institutions still exists. So with these answers, we will close the panel. So Rachel?
Well, in terms of the next generation coming through, I think their greatest challenge is choice. I think they're just going to have so many more choices about which way their career path goes. And I think with technology coming through, the more boring parts, if there are any, if the more tedious parts of the day-to-day work will be done by technology. And that means that allows them to get out and interface with the business, with their customers, and so the choice of their career is unlimited. In my own organisation, we have more than 1,000 qualified accountants, but we only have 800 in finance. That means there's a lot of them doing very different jobs, and as they can move out and back into the pure finance world, it's just the opportunities and choices that they have. My final reflections on today, I hope that everyone drives the car properly in terms of your opening, and that we continue to challenge ourselves and do the very best we can, because if there is one break in that chain, it impacts all of us. So we must every day try to be better. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, Robbie, to your question, I think I'll keep it very short, which is just watch it. How long is it going to last? Because I think in many cases what you will find is that in these cases where countries are succeeding without that, it's driven by enclave part of the economy. You can sell part of your country that's producing natural resources. You can sell that to foreign investors and look like you're growing very fast, and then leave the rest of the country behind. But you're not going to get sustained and inclusive growth for long periods of time without having investment in institutions and in accountable institutions and inclusive institutions that include your citizens. So I think that's also a good way for me to stop on my side the participation here in this conference, and to just say that this has been a 10-year success, so I assume we'll keep it rolling as something that we will continue to invest in as a partnership with this conference. Very important for us to bring these professionals together every year.
I would say in the safeguards to both regain and retain trust, I would go back to what I described as the trust ecosystem. There's no individual player in that ecosystem that by themselves is going to regain and retain trust. So the more we can work together collaboratively with management, governance bodies, auditors, and regulators, the better we'll be to regaining that trust. The other thing I would say is that we have to, I lived a good part of my career in the profession in a way of defending the fact that failures were just exceptions or aberrations. And I think we need to live in a world where every time something happens that isn't ideal, we look at what caused it to come into being. We think about how do we prevent it in the future, or at least reduce its probability of reoccurrence. We'll never be perfect, but we need to continuously learn from our experience, and we need to be constructive about the way we deal with failures, not just destructive as we deal with them. And I think if we do those things, and if we take what I would call the current revolution in technology and information, and say how can we enable those as elements of safeguard, we in fact have a very promising future in looking at regaining and retaining trust of the investing public and of the general public at large.
Alberto, final words?
Thanks, Robbie. That's a very key question. As I said, I'm not saying that this is the only factor, right? But I think it's a critical one. And especially because something that's been floating in this conversation, but beyond, is that we have some sort of hope that we will achieve the ideal of self-governed community through technology, right? Citizens will be able to impact political decisions through technology, which is a dream that I also can be part of, but especially in unequal places like Latin America, let's remember that half of the population doesn't have access to internet, right? And on the other hand, citizens are very busy, right? They work very hard, they have kids, so they don't have the luxury to be following politics and public policy all the time. So until that dream come true, the self-government through technology, which hope one day will arrive, they will have to trust before in their representative in order to trust in their institutions.
Thank you. So thank you very much, everyone. With this, we close the panel. We have some gifts from the organizing committee for the panelists. And an official picture.
Agradecemos a nuestros participantes y un reconocimiento y un pequeño presente de parte del comité organizador para Jan, Rachel, Bill, Alberto y para nuestro moderador, Robbie. Muchas gracias.